This week in class, we are learning about new English colonies in the Americas. Earlier in the week, or one of the assignments you should have already done, dealt with the Lost Colony or the Roanoke Colony, where English settlers, English colonists, tried to create a permanent settlement in the Americas that ultimately failed. Uh, in this Prezi today, we're going to look at the first permanent English settlement in the Americas that lasted. It's permanent, means it lasted. And that settlement is Jamestown. The first thing that we'll look at is what's the definition of a colony? What is a colony? In this case, we're going to define a colony as an area of land where settlers from a foreign country appear, take property from the natives, and then introduce their own culture. And Jamestown definitely fits into that definition. So we're looking at an area of land where settlers from another country show up. They take property, oftentimes from whoever lived there, the natives, and then they end up introducing their own culture. And this slide talks about who were the people who basically set up the Jamestown colony. And they were a company called the Virginia Company, and they were looking to make money. They were a business, and their idea was to create a colony that could make money by growing something or finding gold or selling tickets to go to North America. And they thought they could make money, and that was basically their only goal. And they thought they could make money by getting resources like gold or silver or other things to take back to Great Britain. So the first voyage, the first group of colonists to set up at Jamestown get there in 1607. It's a group of 105 colonists, all men, no women or children, and they got there and they attempted to set up a permanent settlement. So as you can see in this picture, they built their first fort right on the edge of the river and the bay. And this area proved to not be very good for planting things because the soil was actually too moist. There was too much water in the soil. It was also very bad for bugs and mosquitoes and things like that. They would struggle very mightily. Part of the reason why they struggled, if you should have already seen in the assignment where you had to look at the specific job duties of those people that were at Jamestown, when you looked at those specific job duties, you would have noticed that there were a lot of gentlemen that went to Jamestown. And when we say gentlemen, we're talking about people that were well-to-do in society. They were probably fairly rich, didn't really know how to do hard manual labor, and when they got to Jamestown, they didn't want to work. They wanted to be able to just hang out and let other people do the work while they got rich off of it. And this proved to be very costly and very difficult for the first group that got to Jamestown, as many of them end up starving or dying or going back to England because of how hard life was in the colonies. In the Americas, everyone in the colony had to give their effort to farm and to build the fort and anything else that needed to be done. So what happens? The first group of colonists did struggle, as we mentioned in the previous slide. 1607, there's a very difficult time because gentlemen don't want to work. And eventually what really helps save the colony at this point is a man named John Smith takes charge. And John Smith becomes someone who's in charge of the colony because some of the other leaders had either gone back to England or had passed away from disease or something like that. And John Smith says it doesn't matter whether you are a gentleman or not, that you have to work. In fact, he institutes this rule where he says, he who does not work does not eat. And those gentlemen, those rich gentlemen who decided that they didn't feel like they needed to do work, all of a sudden had to make a choice. Were they going to simply continue to not work and not get anything to eat? Or were they going to start working like everyone else? And in turn, they would get to eat with everyone else. And of course, most of them decided to participate in the work. And because everyone was sharing in the work of the carpentry, of building a fort, of planting crops, and all of the things that went into a colony, because everyone shared in the workload, the colony began to do much better. John Smith was a very interesting guy because he really helped turn around the Jamestown colony, but he also was kind of a real tough guy. He got along with the Native Americans very well. You may have seen as a kid the Disney movie Pocahontas. A couple of quick stories about John Smith that go along with Pocahontas. John Smith and Pocahontas never had any type of romantic relationship like Disney would have you believe from that movie. However, John Smith did know Pocahontas. Pocahontas was probably 10 or 11 years old when John Smith met her. She was the daughter of the Native American chief named Powhatan. John Smith was probably 35, between 30 and 40 at the time when he meets Pocahontas, so he was old enough to be her dad. Clearly, no romantic relationship takes place. However, Pocahontas does find an interest in the Europeans, and there is a story where John Smith was in the Native Americans' camp, and Powhatan, the chief of the Native Americans, gave the order for John Smith to be executed. And the way the story goes is that as the Native Americans are raising the axe to chop off John Smith's head, actually it was a clubs. They were going to beat him to death. As they were getting ready to beat him to death, that Pocahontas runs over and puts herself between John Smith and the men with the clubs that are going to beat John Smith. And Powhatan, of course, doesn't want his daughter to be killed, and he says, let the Englishmen go. And Pocahontas saves John Smith's life. We're not really sure, historians aren't really sure if this story is true or not, but it does appear in John Smith's diaries. So we don't have any other evidence, but it's very possible that it did happen. Another quick John Smith story is that one time when him and some of his men were exploring in what is today the Chesapeake Bay near Virginia and Maryland, they were exploring and looking for things, and John Smith was stung by a stingray while they were in the water. And he became so sick that day that he thought he was going to die. In fact, he had his men dig a grave for him because he thought he would die by the time that the sun set that day. And the way that the story goes is that Smith actually miraculously recovers from his stingray wound, and that very evening for dinner he eats the stingray that stung him and almost killed him. So as you can tell from those couple of stories, John Smith was a pretty interesting and a pretty tough guy. He did not, however, have any type of relationship romantically with Pocahontas. So 2 years later, after John Smith takes over, things are going pretty well, but John Smith gets sick and needs to go back to England. So he leaves Virginia and heads back to England, and as soon as he leaves without his strong leadership, the colony begins to fall apart. And part of it falling apart is that the gentlemen who had been working before, under John Smith's if you don't work, you don't eat rule. Some of those gentlemen went back to being lazy and saying, I'm not working, and things like that. And in the winter of 1609 to 1610, the colonists at Jamestown go through something called the starving time. Over the course of this winter, because they had not prepared properly, over the course of this winter, 400 to 500 of the colonists are killed, leaving less than 100 colonists at the end of the winter when the spring comes. The reason why they died is because they had not saved up their food for the winter time. The previous fall and spring, they had not spent time saving up food, and as a result, there wasn't anything to eat, and many of them died of starvation and also malnutrition and disease during this terrible winter of 1609 that becomes known as the starving time. So Jamestown colony is just about wiped out, down to less than 100 people, and they're looking for a way to help get the colony back on track. And just in time arrives a man named John Rolfe. John Rolfe comes to the Jamestown colony, and he helps the colony by doing two specific things. Number one, John Rolfe falls in love with Pocahontas. John Rolfe is probably in his mid-20s at the time. Pocahontas by now is probably around 15 to 16. So while the age difference is still big in our standards today, it's not near as big as a 25 or 30-year difference like John Smith and Pocahontas. And John Rolfe and Pocahontas fall in love, and Pocahontas is actually, as I said earlier, Pocahontas enjoys the Europeans, and she's been spending a lot of time with them, and she ends up marrying John Rolfe. Well, uh, after they get married, they end up heading back to England to kind of on a tour of Europe so that people can see Pocahontas, who has converted to Christianity and is now married um, to John Rolfe. While they're there, she has their first son, and very shortly after their son is born, she ends up getting a disease, and she passes away while they're still in Europe. The other thing that John Rolfe does to really help the success of the Jamestown colony, he does before they go back to Europe, and that is he introduces the crop of tobacco to Virginia. Up until this point, they've grown corn and a few other things, but they have not really found something that the Virginia company can make money off of. And when John Rolfe introduces tobacco, they find that this crop grows extremely well in the wet Virginia climate where they are, and that they can grow lots of it. And as the years go by, the Jamestown settlement becomes more and more and more successful because of this crop, tobacco. Ultimately, that's what leads to success, and the settlement takes off, and over the next 40 or 50 years becomes a place that can make a lot of cash for the British government. So ultimately, that's how Jamestown becomes successful. At this point, you can go ahead and take the quiz that goes with this Prezi. If you have any questions, feel free to send me an email, and I will get back to you as soon as I can.